Welcome to IndoctriNation, a weekly conversation series about protecting yourself from systems of control. I'm your host, Rachel Bernstein.
Hello, everyone. I want to thank all of our listeners all over the world. And I was notified about a lot of people listening to the last couple of episodes in some interesting places, which I love to mention. And so for the last few weeks, there were many listeners in France and Sweden, Estonia, and the Czech Republic. So if you live there, let me know. Let me know what draws you to the show. And so for today on the show, we have Joel Looper. Joel is an adjunct professor at Baylor University and the author of the new book, Another Gospel, Christian Nationalism and the Crisis of Evangelical Identity, in which he offers his fellow evangelicals a unique theological argument for resisting Christian nationalism. Using church history, scriptural reasoning, and even analysis of Russian Christian nationalism, the book argues that another gospel, which is actually not the gospel at all, has colonized American evangelicalism, explaining that decolonization requires a renewal of the church's own gospel-centered political vision. You can find out more about Joel and his work at www.joellooper.com. Here's Joel now. It is my pleasure to have Joel Looper with me today, who is someone who has a lot to share with us about some very important subjects that are affecting our nation, I think the world. So if you don't mind taking a moment and introducing yourself and also talking to us about the book that you wrote, and we'll start our discussion after that.
Glad to. Thank you, Rachel. It's great to be here. I am a theologian by training, in any case. I have studied Dietrich Bonhoeffer and specialized in both German, 20th century German mostly, and American theology. And my wife is an immigration attorney, and we live in Waco, Texas. So there's a lot going on there. The book is Another Gospel, the subtitle of which is Christian Nationalism and the Crisis of Evangelical Identity. And I do think evangelicalism is in the midst of an identity crisis in a number of ways. So I was pleased when Erdman's, the publisher, said, yeah, we can get this thing out before the election, because I think the 2024 election is critical in evangelicalism's identity crisis, especially the evangelical identity crisis.
Okay. And so being a theologian, I grew up knowing a lot of people who are pastors, who are rabbis, who are in a lot of different traditions and faiths. And it draws to it a lot of different kinds of people who were there for a lot of reasons. And so, right, I'm just wondering for you to know a little bit more about you. What drew you to being a theologian?
Well, I, unlike most theologians, am not ordained. So I don't think that I'm equipped currently for pastoral ministry or to be a priest or any such thing. I am a Protestant Christian. So I came to theology, I guess, because the intellectual side of my faith was so personally important to me that I needed to investigate it. I went to seminary, not quite knowing why, what I was called to do. I think this is true of a lot of people. I ended up teaching school for some years after that, and I did participate in certain other ministries. But by 2015, I had this project in mind. I was meeting with a couple of other theologians on a weekly basis who write on Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, by the way, for your listeners who don't know, is a 20th century German theologian who was at least somewhat involved or knowledgeable about the anti-Hitler conspiracies in Germany during the war. So I had this project in mind about Bonhoeffer, and my first book was called Bonhoeffer's America. And he actually came to America, and he had some scathing things to say about American Christianity. And so I couldn't let this project go. And I ended up doing a PhD and wrote that book. And so since then, I met my wife, and we joined an intentional Christian community in Waco. Now, there are some intentional Christian communities out there, and probably some of your listeners are thinking, "Oh my gosh, what kind of guest have you got on here, Rachel? Who is this guy? He's a part of an intentional Christian community." There are some communities out there who have power and control issues, and I think those that are very conscious of that possibility and work against that are the ones that you should gravitate to. But community is really important. I think it's central to the Christian faith as much as it is the other Abrahamic religions, or more. The church is just different from the nation, and that's the polity. That's supposed to be Christians' first polity, their first allegiance. And so, I was drawn to this community in Waco, Texas, and in a place where other religious communities had a pretty terrible history, and so my wife and her parents and certain other people were instrumental in building up this community in the 90s, and these became my people. And I think our commitment, I think that's the right word, to our Hispanic neighbors, to speaking Spanish, to being a bilingual church, especially to welcome everyone, has really been important to me. So that gives you a little background, a little sense of who I am.
Nice. And I wonder also just about this idea of community, because I hear it a lot from people who will say, they'll actually say sort of on the other side, because there's a ton about it that is beautiful and wonderful, and that you need it, and you need it. I mean, we need it evolutionarily for survival. And so we're drawn towards connection in certain ways. And then there are other people who will say to me, I stayed in a not great situation for much longer than I think was healthy for me, because I didn't want to lose the connection. I didn't want to lose the community. Similar to people who were sometimes stay in marriages for longer because they've gotten close to their partner's family and, that circle of friends. And so you can just see how much of a draw, and also in a very primal way, how it really feels like a necessity that you're worried about being without.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this is a really important conversation, theologically speaking, actually. So, what kind of community is the church supposed to be? I think, what is the gospel around which we're oriented as a community? And that's kind of the question that I get into in the book, actually.
And just sort of with very abridged Cliff Notes version, what is it that you get into in the book about this?
So, your listeners are going to, I'm going to take you on a little journey here, listeners, for a minute. We'll get back to Rachel's question in a second. Christian nationalism is, I think, a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Some people label as Christian nationalist anything that is conservative or that they don't like, and out in the political arena, that's very conservative. Let's put it that way. And I don't necessarily think that's a helpful definition. The evangelical writer David French, he thinks much the same thing in that regard. it's an unhelpful word in trying to target what we're talking about. Now, some, I think of Christian nationalists specifically as anti-democratic conservative Christians. I think that gets a little closer to what we're talking about. So the sociologists Sam Perry and Andrew Whitehead have their book, Taking America Back for God, by the way, is excellent. Something your listeners may want to pick up. They define Christian nationalism as a cultural framework that blurs distinctions between Christian identity and American identity. And so the two end up as very closely related. And so they're obsessed with that unity of identity. So I think there's something there that's helpful. A Pew study in 2022 also found that 45% of Americans believe the U.S. should be a Christian nation. This sounds like a lot of people. This sounds like a crisis, right? But then almost all of those people, a huge majority, are committed Democrats, not in the sense of the political party, but in the sense that they are committed to having a democratic republic in which people can disagree with one another. There's a giving and taking of reasons in public, the sort of thing that we would think of as a liberal democracy. They just want their side to, I think, win a little bit more often. I think that's more or less what's meant. So when you look at Perry and Whitehead's definition, I think of the progressives at the beginning of the 20th century who called that century the Christian century, which is where we get the magazine of the liberal Protestant, the progressive magazine. So they are trying to bring Christian principles to industry and so forth. And now today you have William Barber, in North Carolina, and the Poor People's Campaign. So I think it seems unlikely to me, or it seems unhelpful to say, okay, let's say that everyone on the right, even those who are trying to ban abortion or limit certain, LGBTQ rights or whatever it might be, even those people I don't think should necessarily be called Christian nationalists. They might just, want a nation that's a little bit more conservative. So I think from an electoral or cultural standpoint, the issue is really about democracy. Is this person willing to brook dissent in the end, culturally or legally, in terms of lawmaking? And there are people out there like Stephen Wolfe, the author of The Case for Christian Nationalism, and increasing numbers of them, I think, who, they say explicitly, we wouldn't brook dissent, as far as certain things, atheists or, people of certain other religions perhaps would effectively be second-class citizens. So that's the public side of this. Now, the gospel side of this, which I'm focused on in this book, it is more concerning to me. And it would lead us to focus our conversation, I think, on a much wider group of people, not just the Stephen Wolfes of the world or the Dusty Deavers or, people like that. There aren't a few people who I think are believing a sort of Christian nationalist gospel out there. So, Jerry Falwell, of Moral Majority fame, I don't think he should be called a Christian nationalist. He's certainly, he's dead now, but I don't think it's necessarily helpful to call him Christian nationalist. But he was wrong theologically in the ways that Christian nationalists are wrong, in just the same ways. And I'd be happy to get into that, how that is, if you'd like.
Yeah, I would like that. And I think just to point out something as you were talking, and so to put a placeholder in the Jerry Falwell discussion, because I want to make sure to come right back to it. When you were talking about this idea of, 45% saying that they're open to, or they think the U.S. should be a Christian nation. So we get into definitions here, right? And there's so many. And I think about how people define Christianity, and that there's so many different denominations. And so what does Christianity mean? And I think about that, and what will the demands be on you also if you call yourself that, and according to whom? And does it just matter who then gets elected to be in charge of it and how they define it? That's actually, then it'll trickle down and become that everyone has to follow that tradition? Or can you follow your own route towards theology and God according to your faith? It's a murky picture that I think some people might think is a lot cleaner, but it's really not.
Right. And I think of Stephen Wolfe, who wants a pan-denominational Christian nationalism. And you think, how would this work? Like, how would this work? I think effectively what he's saying is that liberal Christians aren't Christians.
Mm-hmm.
That they would be put on one side.
Right. Okay. Back to Falwell. Go for it.
Well, so Falwell, he still very much believed in the good of American democracy, but he essentially, I have in mind this talk that he gave in the early 80s at the Cleveland Club, and he brought up El Salvador. There was a terrible war going on then, and Falwell said, so many people are saying, how can you as a minister of the gospel support what Reagan is doing in El Salvador, sending money, funding death squads, these government death squads? How can you do that? And his answer was very interesting. He said, in essence, what we're doing is we have to Christianize America, and then only through that will we be able to move out and Christianize the world. This was his model. This is what I tell my students at Liberty University, and this is what I think we should be up to. And Ronald Reagan is part of Christianizing America in that regard. And so his enemies are my enemies. Very, very interesting. So he never used the word power in this discussion, but the notion that we have to grasp power in order to make things come out right, in order for our version of justice to prevail, I think is key to Falwell's worldview, or was key to his worldview. This is the central issue for Christian nationalists. They're just a little bit more upfront about it than other evangelicals have been through the years. And so this is, I think, the crisis of evangelical identity. Are we, evangelicals, that is, going to be the sort of people that think that we have to make a certain version of justice a reality through our own efforts? Or are we going to be the kind of people who trust God in that? So the Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Galatians, this is I think one of my favorite letters in the New Testament, and it's key to the book, accused the Galatians of getting caught up in another gospel, which he said isn't a gospel at all. So remember, every Christian at this point's a Jew. And so, Christianity was in essence Jewish heresy. So these new Christians, who we today have sometimes called, perhaps unfortunately, Judaizers, essentially were saying, well, God was working in our nation. He gave us the Torah. He gave us Torah. He's been with us through exile. He gave us this temple. How can you, Paul, and those of your ilk, say that we should abandon all this and let in the Gentiles who are sinners? Now, that would destroy our identity. You're going to let in all of these people who are going to destroy our identity? Really? And you're letting go of the key part of Jewish identity, circumcision. You want to get rid of that? There's a very strong parallel here to Christian nationalists today. And this is key to the book. So for those early Christians, who we call Judaizers, many do anyway, they had put their national identity ahead of their identity as Christians. The nation was more important than the church in their mind. And so for evangelicals today, the nation is certainly more important than the church. In fact, many of them don't even go to church anymore. I think that difference in polity, that difference in who evangelicals people are your people in the church, are your people Americans in general. This shows that there's a difference in the gospel that they've believed, and power is key to it.
Interesting. Very interesting. And so I want to be able to talk about power. And I think about the evangelical movement. I think about being raised in a Jewish tradition and still involved in it. And that if you are converting to Judaism, it's too dramatic to say you're turned away, but that you're told to kind of go and think about it again and see if it really is something that you're coming to on your own. And I think this was kind of a response to being pushed or being forced to convert out of Judaism, or risk death a lot of the time. And so if you say, I want to become Jewish, the person, a rabbi or whomever, is really supposed to say, think about it, do your studying, do your reading, find out if it speaks to you. And then you're kind of told to go think about it again, really so that it is coming from a very internal place. And it can't be that you're doing it for someone else also, or to please someone else, or out of fear. And it's an interesting thing because the whole evangelical movement is worrisome, for people who have been pushed or who have been made to feel like it's that or something awful will happen. And so there is this idea, I think, that part of what you're talking about is the sort of the different ways of approaching it. One is, here, I have something that I think is really lovely and useful. I'd like you to learn about it and know about it and maybe be a part of it. And then there is this other piece that is about power where it gets darker. And so I'd love you to kind of make a distinction, if you can, and get into the power piece also.
I find it odd, first of all, that I worship a first century rabbi whose life ended on a cross.
Mhm.
In complete failure, right? And so I believe that God vindicated that life through resurrection, of course. But the very idea that anyone would think, okay, this story means that we have to grasp power to make everything work out. The contradiction there couldn't go any deeper.
Right.
That's a core theological problem. Some of the key verses in Paul, in the Apostle Paul's work, I believe that this is an early Christian hymn in Philippians chapter 2. So Paul, or perhaps he's quoting someone else there, writes that he who existed in the form of God did not regard equality with God as something to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant and being made in human likeness. And so he's obedient to the point of death. That's what Paul's point is. And only in being obedient to the point of death and emptying himself is he then raised up. And so this was, is of course, the theological bone of contention between Jews and Christians. But I think Christians of all people, the idea that we would, think that Machiavellian power games are the way to enact that gospel, the gospel of that man, makes no sense.
Right? Yeah. I'm sure there's a, well, I find this a lot with religion. There are a lot of times that if you were to apply some sort of equation to it, it just doesn't fit. The X almost becomes a question mark. Like, what? I'm sorry. How? How do we get anything that equals anything here? It's like we need to revise the equation and have it make sense. And maybe they're different equations. But yeah, I wonder about that. What happens when things just don't quite come together? I'm sure you've heard a lot of people kind of forcing things to make sense to come together. Like,
Sure.
right? It feels like a stretch.
And none of us are completely consistent. I mean,
Right.
that's
Right.
life, right? Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Absolutely. Yes.
and but how should I put this? I also respect people wanting to bring their principles, what they think is good into public, and if they think they're helping others. I've met many people, for example, many quite a number of people who I think if an undocumented person showed up on their doorstep, they would help them and then be completely confused about why their friend can't get status in the United States when they have been voting against that sort of thing. And, for years, there's an inconsistency there. And they think they're doing right on both counts. You know, so these sorts of inconsistencies are common. And if we look deep enough, we all have them. But that, at least that one for me, is particularly infuriating, troubling. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Yes, it is. And I've also noticed, just in terms of different personality styles, by you saying what you're saying just now, that yes, we all have inconsistencies. It's sort of part of human nature and part of belief systems. And there are a lot of people who would not admit that. They wouldn't, I think, have the confidence, is where I see it, to say, yes, that's true. Sometimes I say things that are contradictory or that don't quite come together. That instead they get angry with you for even questioning them, which I think happens when you're more involved in sort of the power piece of it. Like, don't question the thing that I said that doesn't make sense. How dare you? And so I really like the way you present it, which is, yeah, this happens. And we're trying to make sense of things as we go along. And sometimes it doesn't come together. And that's just how it is.
Yeah, that's right. That there are a couple of that brings me to think of certain Protestant Christians in particular who want everything to make sense on some level, whether emotionally or intellectually. And this in particular seems to be associated with their connection with the Christian nationalist movement today. And so I thought I'd bring up a couple of examples, both of which might fall under the dominionist thinking. So dominionism has been around for a while, and if your listeners want to learn more of it, more about it, I think of Francis Fitzgerald's book, The Evangelicals, which has some good work done there, and Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Dumetz, very good book. Both of those at least touch on some of these movements, but Christian Reconstructionism is the first term that I'll use. So these folks really blossomed in certain corners of U.S. culture in the 70s. There was a fellow named Rush Dooney who was a off the beaten path kind of theologian and a rather strange reformed in the magisterial Protestant rather than Reform or rather than Jewish sense. So these folks are not averse to building some pretty dramatic theological castles in the sky, intellectually speaking. The other folks that I'll bring up are Seven Story Mountain. They are a Pentecostal charismatic movement, and I think that Trump's former advisor Paula White belongs to this group. So these folks, who I don't know quite as well, think that taking America back for God, to steal Perry and Whitehead's title there, is what God is calling them to. And they hear this, this inward voice, and of course it's also coming from the pulpit, and so that Pentecostal example is an important one. A third, which I'm just learning about this week, is called mercy culture. There have been a couple of articles about it, and they are they're also Pentecostal, very politically involved, and it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of mercy in mercy culture either. So if you're driving around, especially in where I'm located in Texas, you might well encounter mercy culture. So these are some Protestant communities where Christian nationalism would crop up, even if not everybody in them should be identified as a Christian nationalist. This kind of thinking, this what I would say anti-gospel thinking, is core to their identity.
Huh. Very interesting. So I'm wondering, going back to this idea of needing to define things and also realizing that sometimes the words that are used are going to be almost a distraction from how things really are, like the idea of mercy, because we're going to define that in a very gentle way, offering someone grace. Doesn't sound like that's how it is. So if you can help us understand what mercy culture is, and maybe to figure out why it might be called that, and if it's sort of purposefully a misnomer. I'm not, it's hard to know when things are the exact opposite of what they're called. Yeah.
Well, I don't know much about it myself, but I do know that the title was, I think I picked this up from a Washington Post piece, was picked based on what the things that they wanted their community to be like. So they first of all wanted mercy to be involved here. And I'm guessing that means to draw in as many people as possible. But they also wanted to save the culture. And that's where the culture piece comes in. So that signals, I think, that power, which in certain cases will run counter to mercy, not always, but I think in many cases will. So you see, in other words, that there's a sort of contradiction at the core of their identity, or there's a tension. I'll put it that way.
Right. So I'm wondering then about this power, to go back to that, and then I'm also curious more about the election coming up, and also about Bonhoeffer, because it's not something we've really talked about, and he's not someone we've talked about on the podcast before. And I think people are going to be curious about the phrase that you used before, the anti-Hitler conspiracies, because that's definitely a phrase that people are going to say, what was that? Right?
You're just going to pass over that,
right,
and not come back to it? What's up with this?
Right, exactly.
Well, I'll talk a little bit about Bonhoeffer here. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer was not involved directly in attempting to kill Hitler, as some Protestants. This guy is a folk hero in many places, both in Germany and in the United States. And certain American evangelicals have tried to remake this fellow in their image, but he was none of these things. He was neither an American liberal or an American conservative. He was a German Lutheran. Because he was a German Lutheran in that time, despite helping to save some Jews, which is what he got arrested for, he himself had some residual anti-Semitism. So he's, this guy he's not perfect for sure. And so I think we should say that right off. But Bonhoeffer has been taken up as kind of a guiding light by a fellow named Eric Metaxas and many other evangelicals. Metaxas has been an election denier and someone who has vigorously supported Donald Trump. And it's just worth noting again that Bonhoeffer's theology really bore no resemblance to Metaxas's. Metaxas avoids his last letters entirely, in which Bonhoeffer speaks of the Christian movement being a quiet one going forward. People, people few in number, and that prayer and good works, that's what we should be up to. So, and even in the midst of the Holocaust, you still have German Christians speaking loudly in such a loud voice. Bonhoeffer was not one of those people. So when it comes to the use of Bonhoeffer, making him and his sort of perceived moral authority, and I think you could make that case that he has some moral authority. His name is brought in to justify all sorts of things. And in Metaxas's case, it's simply standing up for, what could be in some people's minds a very risky position, namely saying that, Donald Trump actually won the 2020 election. Now I'm thinking about a podcast that Metaxas himself was on. It's his own podcast, actually. And he had Trump on right after the election.
Wow.
And
just the way you say, yeah.
Both of them were, especially Metaxas, though, was worked up. He was angry and about the loss. And he said, "This is everything," at one point. It couldn't have been more of a punctuation mark if he'd been pounding his desk while he said it. And so for him, the 2020 election was everything. Where would you come up with such an idea from the scriptures, the New Testament? Where would you get this from the Christian scriptures? It's just beyond me. And so I suspect in the end that what's happened is people like Metaxas have a very strong sense of personal identity with the Bible. This is who I am. They have a very strong personal identity as a conservative American. This is their tribe. So the idea that there may be some pretty significant tension between them never comes up. So you don't have to be a fully fledged Christian nationalist to have that problem. You just have to not see that Christ's life and death will lead one to have a different relationship with power than other people, or should.
Mm-hmm. Right, or should. I mean, that's a really good distinction. I think that's important because some people are not, they're not drawn towards that way of thinking where it feels, this is my bias, but it feels more reasonable. It feels more humanistic, like really, let's look at this and let's look at the inherent dangers of looking at it in a different way. And the drug of that, that can get people out of control, actually.
And there is a really twisted way to manipulate people that you probably thought of this already. Christ, he gave up everything. He emptied himself. And you should too for this cause that I'm, or for this movement or this church or whatever, that I'm setting before you, or just in obedience to me. This happens all the time, as you know better than I do. So that kind of self-emptying, that kind of self-giving, it can't be something that someone else is demanding of you, in that there has to be a forward draw, toward, in this case, the person of Christ.
Right. Because otherwise it feels like you're just using it. You're using it for your own gain. You're using the guilt a sense of responsibility, of kind of helping people see that they should aspire to be Christ-like, but for you. What? I mean, that is just a huge leap in my mind, but not for other people. I mean, it feels so, I don't know, it feels really pathological to me, to say, look at this person who's really suffered and went through something so awful. So be like him for my gain. And the entitlement in that is just palpable.
Yeah. And so I'll get back a little bit into my biography in response to this observation. I grew up evangelical too. So of course I thought that evangelicalism was one thing, and others thought that it was apparently I think it's something else. But as I've grown up, I have heard more and more and more stories about people experiencing just what you're talking about there, using the example of Christ and self-giving, his cruciform, in those terms, life for somebody else's gain, or they're using that example for their own gain and manipulating others to serve them. And the more I hear these examples, the more I think, well, what exactly is evangelicalism? Is there anything particular there? Is there one evangelical movement? So the question of whether or not I should continue to identify with such a movement, that has oppressed so many people, has been a question in my mind for a long time. And I do, subscribe to many of the Orthodox Protestant doctrines, not all, but many of the core ones. If this is where that leads, what does that mean? For me. And so I think a lot of people are going through that right now. A lot of people are saying, well, wait a minute. The experience that I had doesn't really bear a whole lot of resemblance to the gospel that I was preached. So I'm out of here. I'm done. I've had quite a few friends in recent years say, whether they're evangelical or mainline or whatever, they've said, I'm done. I can't deal with this. One of them, in response to a good friend of mine, in response to a book that I sent him about the history of evangelicalism.
It's interesting. My youngest is at a college Dartmouth, that has a wonderful reputation now, but its history is really checkered because it was a place where Native Americans, were brought in to be basically converted into not following their tradition. And there are these buildings there that were where these Native American kind of, I don't know if they were children or teenagers, were brought in. Their hair was cut, which is holy for them. So now there's free tuition for anyone who has Native American ancestry. And they're trying to do what they can. And it's on, like, my daughter gives tours as part of the things she does on campus. And that has to be part of the tour. You have to talk about it, which is really, I think, commendable. Yeah. But I remember talking to her and other people about how is it different from the fact that in front of our house we have a mezuzah, this parchment that has the Shema, the prayer about believing in God, out in front of the house, which draws people to come to our house to try to convert us. A lot of people, and on Jewish holidays, like the high holidays, the holiest days of the year, the doorbell rings. Have you thought about being saved? And do you need something? And there was this idea of you're seen as not quite complete, not okay the way you are, not safe the way you are, not valid enough.
Yeah.
What's interesting, though, is that there is, and I think there always can be, a way to do things that isn't about being disrespectful of the other, but rather saying, we have something that's really, we feel is really fantastic. And if you'd like to learn more, here it is, but not, you're not okay the way you are. Like, there is a whole tone difference that I think shouldn't mar the whole movement or any whole movement. And it sounds like what you're trying to do here, or trying to connect to, is the part of it that feels more kind of benevolent and beautiful, without needing to throw it all away just because people have taken advantage of that and have had way more hostile intentions. And so, but it's an interesting distinction. And I'm sure hard to be kind of up against the forces, or maybe growing forces, of people who are handling it in a very different way than your conscience is going to want you to handle it. It's just, I'm sure it's difficult to really hold true. I mean, I know that would be true for me. Like, how do I hold on to this in a way that feels really aligned with my morality? Right?
Well, it's not just me.
Right.
I think of this was 2015, and my father's a pastor in Michigan, and in southern Michigan, and I came home. I was in Texas by this point, and I was talking to an elder in this church about Trump, and what is up with this is incredible. And I said, well, what do you think of this guy? And he turns around and he looks back at me, he leans in and he says, well, I think he's Hitler, but you can't say that around here. So many evangelical churches in recent years have had a line, an invisible line, that's opened up, or maybe a gulf. That's a better metaphor. That's opened up right down the middle of these churches. It's not even so much Trump, although it might appear that way to many, or COVID protocols, or whatever it might be. It's the relationship between the gospel and power. What does the gospel enjoin us to do? How are we supposed to live? Are we supposed to live as a cruciform people, or do we need to take America back for our kind of people? The white hats, as opposed to is owning the libs the end, and measure the gospel. And so those are two completely different ways of viewing things. And so you have two different gospels, essentially. You have two different communities in the midst of the same building. So that's why evangelical churches are falling apart. That's why people are leaving the movement, is because of this difference in vision. It's a difference that goes all the way down.
Right. Yes. And I wonder also, I know that we're coming to the end of our time together, which is a shame. There's a lot to talk about. I would love to talk more about the upcoming election and what you foresee potentially happening, and what would be good for the listeners to be looking out for.
Like the rest of you, I'm watching the polls, and I'm not a little unnerved. I expect it's possible that we may have Trump in office again. I think we all need to be prepared for that in whatever way that's possible. What I want to be sure that people hear about that is, I think if that happens, it's because evangelicals put him there. Evangelicals are a very large voting bloc, and they're more monolithic than Jews or Catholics, or most of the other blocks. And if evangelicals put him in office, that will be the destruction of the evangelical movement, because the gospel that evangelicals will have grasped hold of at that point is an unbiblical gospel without Jesus, really. I mean, how does Jesus come into such a gospel? And at that point, the church no longer really comes into it either. A significant percentage of American Muslims call themselves evangelical today, and a non-negligible number of Hindus call themselves evangelical. Why is this? It's because evangelical now just means conservative Republican. So look up Ryan Burge's research on this, and is a sociologist, and your listeners will find more information on that. But if evangelicals no longer need to go to church to be evangelical, and no longer need to believe anything particular about Christ to be evangelical, and sooner or later they will have lost the thread of what they're doing in church and why they're doing it. And then we'll just have a large group of conservative, nationalistic mainly white Americans, who don't anymore have this story of self-giving love within their mental landscape.
Wow. It is so mind-bending to me when something that has what I think is a clear definition is suddenly completely redefined. Because then we don't know what we're talking about. It's so unmooring. I don't know how else to describe it. Like you've lost your anchor when you don't know what something means. And if then evangelical is about being conservative, my goodness, that is, why don't they just call it conservative? It's just sort of to take
Right.
over. And I'm sure it's right. And I'm sure it's really hard for people who are evangelical and who are looking at it with a connection to its actual definition and seeing how it was stolen, basically repurposed. That's very hard, I'm sure.
It is. I think it is for many.
So it's great that you're out there through a theological lens, but also being the voice of reason and kindness and inclusion, and just let's all just get along, but also let's learn together, and be open together and connected and have community and not be divisive. And what you want is for that to be the voice of the majority, not the minority. And it gets scary when it feels like it's the voice of the minority suddenly.
And let's actually look again at what the gospel that this man Jesus of Nazareth brought. This kingdom of God. Let's look again and ask together, what was that? What was that about? I think that doing that is the way forward for evangelicals.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I thank you for your insight, and just the way you approach things. And please let people know where they can find your book and just find you and other things that you are doing out there where they'd like to learn from you.
The new book is Another Gospel, the Christian Nationalism and the Crisis of Evangelical Identity. It's out August 27th. I'm trying to remember myself. And so you can, Erdman's, the publisher, has kindly offered an advanced digital copy, which you can get with pre-order. Just sign up on a form. You can, find me on Twitter or on Facebook and find that form. And so you get an advanced digital copy, and we can have a Zoom conversation, talk a little bit more about what Rachel and I have discussed today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
One more thing before you go. Thank you so much to Joel for coming on the show today. It is great to be able to speak with someone who is a professor, someone who loves to teach. And sometimes that comes through when I am interviewing people who are teachers. The things they say are so well put together, and it's lovely to learn from new people. There is something very interesting also about hearing somebody talk who is really talking about identity. Who are you as a religious person? Who are you as a Christian? Who are you as any religion? And I know that Joel and I talked about the idea of being an evangelical, being someone who missionizes. And the impact that that has for people like within my community who were really pushed to the brink, pushed to their deaths at times, made to choose between converting or dying, and a lot in our history. And the same thing with other religions as well. So there's going to be a reaction that I have and other people have to hearing the term missionary or mission or evangelical. I really like how open Joel is about really explaining what that's all about, being open to seeing things in new ways, being open to being inclusive as well, making sure that you as a teacher are helping students not only learn what you want them to learn, but really feel comfortable in their own skin, which is a very important part of teaching, I think. It's something that should be part of every curriculum, I think, helping people have self-efficacy, helping people have self-confidence, helping people feel that they are okay the way they are. They don't need to change, they don't need to be different, but they can feel loved and included. What I think is also interesting when we talk about identity is that, as Joel described it, Christian nationalism, in its sort of newest form, is something without a solid identity. He said that it's defined in different ways by different people. And so how do you know what you're a part of? And how do you know if you're part of a movement, if it's defined different ways by different people? When I see that happening, when a term, Christian nationalism, is defined different ways by different people, I look at that psychologically. And I see conflict, and I see dissension, and I see a struggle that for a lot of people, they want it to be something. They want it to be something other than what it might have been intended to be, or they want it to be something that fits where they think the world should be going, that fits their biases. If you can define something in your own way, then how much credence does it have as a term? But I think that there are people who are trying to push it along, to go along a track that they think the world should be going in, and they can then call themselves Christian nationals in order to say that they're part of this very large movement that's very powerful. But it lets me know that if someone calls themselves that, you need to ask them, what does that mean to you? What is your vision for that? What do you like about it? What do you not like about it? Where would you like to see it going? And what changes do you want it to produce in your country or in the world around you? I have a feeling you'll get a lot of different answers. So this is something in flux, but it's still something to watch out for. Because as I'm hearing more and more about it, it's going to affect all of us in ways that we can't predict. Best to be educated, best to understand it, but best to inquire when someone says that they are that, what they mean, and how much it impacts the way they see the world, and also how much it impacts the way they see you, and if they give your life validity or if they judge it, if they accept you or if they don't. Thank you so much to Joel. Thank you to everybody. Talk to you next week. Thank you very much for listening. Please support IndoctriNation on Patreon at patreon.com/indoctrination. Be sure to give us a follow on our social media. Find us on Facebook and Instagram using @IndoctriNation Podcast. And for Twitter, find us at @_indoctrination. We love hearing from you too. So send us an email at indoctrinationshow
indoctrination@gmail.com. And for more updates on the show, visit our website at www.podpage.com/indoctrination.